Tim, I'm sitting on an airplane and I'm thinking about nature of stuff, and I have these words flying through my head: consciousness, awareness. I'm a person. I'm a self. We have all these conceptions of what it means to be human, and they're slightly different. If we focus on the concept of self, what does that mean, and how do these other ideas relate to it?
The notion of a self is a loaded one. There are so many different ways in which this term is employed, but by theorists of different stripes. It's interesting to note that we don't often talk about selves as such in ordinary life. We talk about yourself or myself, but we don't ask how many selves are coming to the party. It's a term of art, and I think we need to keep that in mind. And as with many terms of art, how I use it may be different from how someone else uses it. So that's the first thing I think needs to be kept in mind. What work does the work self do in different theories? Partly we're biological selves. We're human beings, we're organisms, we're members of a certain evolutionary tree, and we have selves in the sense that we can think of ourselves as ourselves. That's a uniquely human capacity. So I can think of myself as a professor. I can think of myself as the child of my parents. I can think of myself in different ways. And part of what people mean when they talk about the self is not a thing. You don't want to reify it and treat it as a thing necessarily, although the self often is treated as a thing. But part of what they mean is a capacity, or a set of capacities, a constellation of capacities to time travel back into autobiographical memory. That's a wonderful capacity that's probably uniquely human. So I can ask you, what was it like for you as a child in your family holidays?
So I have the feeling that that's my same self.
Right.
That my self travels pretty coherently through time, even though visually it looks very different.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and what we do is we have something here. Here's a metaphorical way of putting it. We have something like an eye, which tracks various ways we have of thinking about ourselves. Mm-hmm. So we have a word in the language of thought. Suppose the language of mentality is, suppose there's a language of mentality, and there's a word in that language which picks you out, and it picks you out directly. It's not like your name, because of course you can be amnesic. You can forget, I can forget that my name's Tim Bayne. You can forget what your name is, and you can read about yourself in a library without realizing that it's you that you're reading about, right? You can read the novel of your life. But we have this word, which doesn't pick us out in the way a proper name does, but it's just a label for us, which we couldn't fail to recognize as the label for ourselves, unlike our names. You can't be amnesic for the eye. Just there's no room for that kind of amnesia. And something about our cognitive architecture, something about the way the mind is built. It's a wonderful thing, it's a mysterious thing. Attaches the same I to memories, to perceptions, to thoughts, so that it's very rare for you to have a thought and you think, is that my thought? Or maybe it's someone else's thought. Right? We instinctively identify thoughts, perceptions as our own. And perhaps this capacity can sometimes break down. In some pathologies, people seems to become a question for them whether their thoughts are their own in a real sense. That's a very strange pathology, but normally speaking, the sense of the I gets attached to the contents of our thoughts.
Is there a difference between a self and a person?
I don't think there's any difference unless you make the case that there's a difference. So you can say, by person I mean this, and by self I mean that. But I don't hear any difference between a person. Other than this, let me take some of that back a little bit. Let me say there's a little bit of a difference. The notion of a person is often taken to have moral responsibility. Persons are creatures that think of themselves in moral terms. And I think there's a notion of a self which is more primitive than that.
Mm-hmm.
I think that young children may have a notion of, maybe aware of themselves as selves, where we might not want to hold them responsible. We might not want to think of them as fully fledged persons. But both of these terms are terms of art, and they come loaded with certain, we think persons have rights, for example.
Right, but therefore they are a term of art. But to understand that, even if they're slightly different or people define it differently, they help us to understand the shape of the whole picture we're trying to talk about. So I would imagine a self to be more primitive, to be reflecting of some kind of I, an inner unity, and pretty much that's it.
Yeah.
Whereas when I think of a person, I think of certain kinds of characteristics, beliefs, intents. Legal responsibilities is a higher order thing. But I invest this self with some other properties.
Right. I think that's a very natural thing to do. I think many of us do that. But one can dislodge that move as well. You take someone who's been in a horrific car accident. Maybe they're in a coma for many years, and maybe they emerge out of it after some period with a massively altered set of memories, set of personality. Now, is it the same person? Well, we don't quite know what to say.
Vernacularly, sometimes we would say that's not the same person, but we wouldn't mean it in a deep philosophical sense.
Well, that's kind of the issue, right? We do mean it and we don't mean it. It's the same. It's the same human being. That's certainly true. But what we attach to personhood, the importance that we attach to personhood, what we care about, that in many respects has been lost. So that's the sense in which I think we do mean what we say when we say it's a different person.
But that entity would still be a self.
We think it's the same bearer of rights and responsibilities. She's still my sister, or he's still my brother. So it's the same person in that sense, the same self in that sense. But they might not own their previous memories in the same way that a person who hasn't been brain damaged in this way might.